At my grandson's baby shower, my daughter-in-law picked up the blanket I'd spent 4 months knitting, wrinkled her nose, and dropped it in the trash can. "We only use luxury things here," she said, smiling for the camera her friend was holding. The room did that awful half-laugh. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I walked over, lifted my blanket out of the bin, folded it into my bag, and went home early without a single word. That night, my son called me, and his voice was already breaking before he finished the first sentence. "Mom," he said, "please, what was folded inside that blanket?" I sat down at my kitchen table. I held the blanket in my lap, my husband's last gift still tucked safe inside its lining. And I said very gently, "Why do you ask, Nathan?" "Because here's what my daughter-in-law threw in the garbage in front of 20 people for the crime of being homemade. And here's what happened when the whole family finally found out. My name is Beverly Ashford. I'm 66, and for 38 years I ran a small tailoring and alteration shop on Maple Grove Road, where I let out wedding dresses and hemmed funeral trousers, and taught half the women in my town to thread a machine without swearing. I know fabric the way some people know music. I can tell you what a garment cost by how it's stitched, and I can tell you what it's worth by something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with the price tag. My hands aren't what they were. The arthritis arrived about 4 years ago, the way these things do, gradually, and then all at once. There are mornings my fingers won't close around a needle until I've run them under hot water and coaxed them like stubborn children. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it so you understand what 4 months of knitting actually cost me and why I did it anyway. People look at a woman like me and they see a sweet older lady with yarn, harmless, quietly behind the times. My daughter-in-law looked at me and saw exactly that. And I let her, because I learned a long time ago that being underestimated is its own kind of quiet advantage. I spent 38 years watching people walk into my shop in $1,000 coats with the buttons sewn on by a machine that didn't care, and walk out happier in a 40-year-old wool jacket I'd mended by hand. I know what lasts and what doesn't, and I knew the night my son called me with his voice in pieces that my daughter-in-law had just learned the difference the hard way. Let me start where it really starts, with Gerald. My husband Gerald passed 11 months before that baby shower, 41 years of marriage, and then a Monday morning in the hospital, and then a house that became suddenly, permanently, too quiet. Gerald was not a flashy man. He drove the same pickup truck for 17 years. He wore the same navy cardigan until I finally retired it for him. He was the kind of man who'd notice the teenager bagging groceries looked exhausted and slip an extra $10 into the bag and never mention it to anyone. But Gerald was a saver, not a hoarder of money, a planter of it. He thought in decades. While other men bought boats and vacation properties, Gerald bought small, boring things and let time do the work. Time's the only thing that pays interest on patience, he used to tell me. I didn't fully understand until near the end how long he'd been planning for a person who didn't exist yet. Gerald wanted to be a grandfather more than he'd ever wanted much of anything. We'd waited a long time for it. Nathan, our only child, married late to Claudia, and the baby took a while to come. Gerald used to talk about it on the back porch in the evenings, the fishing trips he'd take, the terrible jokes he'd subject the poor child to, the absolute chaos he intended to cause. He didn't make it. The baby was a whisper of news, a due date circled on a calendar when Gerald's heart finally set down its tools. But here's the thing about a man who thinks in decades. He'd been getting ready to be a grandfather for nearly 30 years before there was a grandchild to be ready for. And he'd hidden the proof of it all that time, in a place where I'd find it when it mattered most. About a week before Gerald died, when we both knew the shape of things, he asked me to bring him the old wooden box from the top shelf of his closet. I'd seen that box for 30 years and never once opened it. I assumed it was receipts or his grandfather's service medals or the kind of nothing a man keeps, because throwing it out feels like a small betrayal. It was full of savings bonds, stacks of them, rubber-banded by year, going back further than I'd imagined. United States savings bonds, bought a little at a time. 50 here, 100 there. Every birthday and every bonus and every good month for almost 30 years. On the envelope in Gerald's square blocky handwriting it said, "For our first grandbaby." I started the year Nathan turned 11, Gerald told me, his voice thin but his eyes clear. Figured someday there'd be a little one. Wanted to hand them a head start nobody could take away. He squeezed my hand. "They've all come due now, Bev. 30 years. They're worth real money." I asked him how much. He told me. "I won't make you wait for the number the way the family had to. It was just under $50,000. Then Gerald told me the part that mattered more than the money. The part I think about every single day. "Don't just hand them an envelope," he said. "Money in an envelope they'll spend on a stroller and forget where it came from." He smiled. The old Gerald smile. "Put it somewhere they'll keep. Sew it into something. Make her look, Bev. Make them find it. Make it last. Make her look inside the blanket." It was nearly the last clear instruction my husband ever gave me, and I intended to honor it down to the letter. So I knitted a blanket. I started the month after the funeral, partly for the baby and partly, I'll be honest, to give my hands something to do besides shake. Cream-colored wool, soft as anything, with a border of tiny green sailboats, because Gerald loved the water, because he'd promised that baby fishing trips he'd never get to take. In one corner, small enough that you'd have to know to look, I knitted his initials, GRA. So a piece of him would be in the room for every nap, every fever, every bad dream, forever. It took 4 months. My hands made me pay for every single row. There were nights I cried over it, not from the pain, but from the missing. But I finished it, and it was, I'll say without false modesty, the most beautiful thing I have ever made. Then I did the real work. On the underside, I sewed a flat inner pocket, the kind I used to stitch into coat linings for travelers who didn't trust their luggage with their valuables. Into that pocket, I folded Gerald's bonds, all 30 years of them, and one more thing, a letter. Gerald had dictated it to me in the hospital in his own halting, careful words, and made me write it down and read it back twice to make sure every word was right. A letter to the grandchild he would never meet, about who he was and who they came from and what he hoped for them. Sealed in an envelope that said to be opened when you're 18. All my love, Grandpa Gerald. I folded the bonds and the letter into the blanket's lining and stitched it shut, neat and invisible. $50,000 and a dying man's last words, sewn with love into something a young woman would call homemade. I wrapped it in plain ivory paper, tied it with a ribbon the green of the sailboats, and I went to the baby shower. I should tell you about Claudia because I don't want her to be a cartoon. She's more than that, and the more of it is the sad part. My daughter-in-law grew up the only child of a woman named Renee, who measures the entire world in brand names. I met Renee exactly twice before the wedding, and both times she found a way to work in what her handbag had cost. Claudia was raised to believe that the worth of a thing, a coat, a car, a person, is printed on a little label, and that the worst fate that can befall a woman is to be seen as ordinary. So Claudia curates everything. The apartment looks like a magazine. The wardrobe is deliberate. And ever since the pregnancy, the baby had become the ultimate statement piece. A designer nursery, a registry full of brands I'd never heard of and couldn't pronounce, a whole carefully constructed aesthetic of a perfect glowing life, documented and photographed and admired by thousands of strangers online. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. She wasn't cruel to me in the early days, not exactly. She just looked at me the way she looked at a charity shop, with a kind of polite, faint distaste, like proximity alone might be catching. Underneath all the labels, I think Claudia is frightened the way her mother taught her to be, that if the wrong person looks too closely, they'll find something ordinary. And the cruel joke about people like that is they can't recognize the genuinely precious when it's right in front of them because it doesn't come with a logo. She was about to prove that in front of 20 people with a camera running. She just had no idea what she was holding when she did it. And I should tell you about Nathan because the part of this story that still aches the most isn't Claudia. It's him. Nathan is a good man who has spent his whole adult life avoiding conflict the way some people avoid heights. He's gentle. He's funny. He loved his father fiercely. And he fell hard for Claudia. And somewhere in the falling, he started going quiet, agreeing, smoothing things over, keeping the peace because it was easier. And Nathan has always chosen easier. After Gerald died, Nathan fell apart the way quiet men do privately, where it doesn't inconvenience anyone. He'd call me late some nights just to talk about his dad. He kept Gerald's old fishing cap on a hook by his front door. He, of all people, knew exactly who his father was, which is why when the truth came out, it didn't break Claudia. Claudia deflected. It broke Nathan, because Nathan was standing right there at that shower. Nathan watched his wife call his dead father's gift homemade and drop it in the trash. And Nathan, keeping the peace, choosing easier, said nothing. Laughed along a little even, the nervous laugh. He didn't know what was inside. I want to be fair about that, but he knew the blanket was from me, knew his grieving mother had made it with her ruined hands, and he let it go in the bin to avoid a scene. That's the thing he's going to carry, not Claudia's cruelty, but his own silence. Remember that when we get to the phone call. Remember that the voice breaking on the other end of that line was a son who had just understood what his own quiet had cost him. The shower invitation came on heavy cardstock with gold edges. Claudia's garden celebration, it said. There was a dress code. For a baby shower. I didn't mind. I was genuinely excited. I had the most important gift in the world sitting wrapped on my dresser, and I'd practiced in my head how it would go. Claudia would open it, find the soft cream blanket, and then I'd say gently, "There's something inside, sweetheart." From Gerald. Feel along the bottom seam, and she'd find the pocket and the bonds and the letter, and the whole room would understand that the quiet man who couldn't be there had been planning for this baby for 30 years. I bought a new blouse for the occasion, lavender with small pearl buttons. I wrapped the gift in ivory paper because the blanket didn't need gold edges to be precious. I tied it with the green ribbon, and I drove over with the box on the passenger seat where Gerald used to sit, and I talked to him a little on the way I do. "Big day, Gerald," I said. "We're giving them your bonds. Can you believe it? We're finally going to be grandparents after all. I had no idea I was about to watch someone drop my husband into a garbage can." Renee's house was dressed up like the inside of a boutique hotel. White flowers everywhere, a balloon arch in cream and pale gold, a table of tiny, elegant catered things that cost more than they fed. There was a backdrop with the baby's name in gold script. They'd chosen Elliot. I felt like a wren that had flown in through an open window. Everyone was younger, glossier, in clothes that knew they were being photographed. I clutched my ivory box and I smiled, and I found a chair near the edge where the older relative is meant to sit. But I wasn't unhappy. I had my secret, and secrets keep you warm. Every time a young woman in a dress, worth more than my monthly groceries, glanced at my plain box with that little flicker of pity, I just thought about the pocket sewn into the lining, and I smiled to myself. I want you to understand that. Because of everything that happened that day, that's the part I grieve most. I walked in happy. I walked in carrying my dead husband's love for a baby he'd never get to hold, ready to give it away with both hands, glad to do it. I had no armor on. Why would I? You don't wear armor to a baby shower. You bring a blanket and a full heart, and you assume the people in the room will at least be kind. I was about to learn that some rooms will throw your whole heart in the trash and call it a vibe. There was a woman by the gift table with her phone out filming. Claudia's friend Destiny, capturing content for Claudia's page. I didn't think anything of it then. I'd think a great deal about it later. The whole event was built around the gift opening, which Claudia ran like a product launch. She sat in a white throne-like chair under the balloon arch. Destiny filmed. Renee narrated for the room. "Oh, that's the Italian brand, isn't it gorgeous?" And Claudia held each gift up to the camera, named the label, and thanked the giver by tagging them in the air as though the whole point of a present was the name it announced. A cashmere onesie, a designer changing bag that cost what I used to take home in a week, a pram with a name like a luxury car, each one held up, admired, photographed, cooed over. The currency in that room was visible, and I didn't have any of it. I watched Nathan across the room. He stood near the wall with a drink he wasn't drinking, wearing the smile of a man who would rather be anywhere else on earth. He caught my eye once and gave me a small, helpless shrug, like a boy apologizing for weather. I should have read that shrug better than I did. It was the shrug of a man who already knew his wife was going to do something unkind and had already decided not to stop her. My sister-in-law, Patricia, was there. Gerald's younger sister, 63, sharp and warm, the one person in that room besides me who had loved Gerald the way I had. She squeezed in beside me. "Designer changing bag," she muttered. "In my day, we used a tote bag and the baby survived." I laughed. She patted my box. "Is that the famous blanket? Gerald told me what you were putting inside it, you know, the old softie." She winked. "That baby is one lucky little fish." I had no idea that Patricia's knowing, and her assuming everyone else knew too, would become the fuse on the whole thing. "You should tell Claudia before she opens it," Patricia whispered, "about the bonds, so she's careful." I shook my head, smiling. Gerald's orders. Make her look inside. Find it herself. I'll point her to the seam after. Patricia chuckled. He always did love a bit of theater, my brother. I think about that exchange a lot. If I'd listened to Patricia, if I'd stood up and announced before Claudia touched it that there was $50,000 and Gerald's last letter sewn inside, none of what followed would have happened. Claudia would have handled it like the crown jewels. There would have been no story. But I didn't, because I was honoring a dying man's wish. And because honestly, it never occurred to me in 1,000 years that anyone would simply throw a handmade blanket away. Perhaps set it aside politely, perhaps regift it quietly later, but throw it into a trash can in front of everyone with a camera running? That was a failure of imagination on my part. I'd lived 66 years and never met cruelty quite that casual. I didn't know to guard against it. The gifts dwindled. The designer pile grew into a small mountain beside Claudia's chair, and then there were only 2 presents left on the table, a gift card in an envelope and my plain ivory box with its green ribbon. Renee picked up my box and read the little tag. "From Grandma Beverly," she announced, with the gentle condescension you'd use for a child's macaroni painting. A few people went, "Aw." Claudia took the box, gave the plain wrapping a quick assessing look, and the corner of her mouth did something I didn't like. "Let's see what Grandma made," she said, and she pulled off the paper. For one moment, just one, I let myself hope. The ivory paper fell away, and there it was. 4 months of my hands, the softest wool I could find, the tiny green sailboats marching along the border, Gerald's initials hidden in the corner like a held breath. In that bright, glossy room full of things made by machines and factories, my blanket looked to my eyes like the only real thing there. Claudia held it up by 2 corners, the way you'd hold something to check it for damage. I watched her face register that it was handmade, the slight imperfection that means a human being made this with love and arthritic hands through grief. I watched her decide what that meant. Her nose wrinkled, just slightly, the micro-expression of a woman who had been taught her whole life that handmade is a polite word for cheap. "Oh," she said, "did you make this yourself?" "I did, sweetheart. I said, and I started to lean forward to tell her about the seam, about Gerald, about feeling along the bottom. There's something special inside it if you just... But Claudia was already talking over me, to the room, to the camera. "That's so sweet," she said, in the voice people use to end a conversation. "It's very homemade." And Renee laughed that little tinkling laugh and said, "Bless her heart." I felt the room tilt slightly, the old familiar feeling of being made small, but I still didn't understand how far she would take it. What happened next happened fast, and I have replayed it in slow motion 10,000 times since. Claudia folded the blanket back over her arm with a kind of finality. She looked around at her perfect party, her registry mountain, her watching friends, her filming destiny. And I watched her make a calculation, the social arithmetic of a woman who lives for an audience. A handmade blanket didn't fit the picture. It clashed with the brand. And Claudia had a camera running and a room to perform for. And somewhere in her label-measured heart, she decided that the funny, on-brand, content-worthy thing to do was to make a little joke of it. There was a tall steel bin at the end of the gift table, the nice kind, lined with a crisp white bag for the torn wrapping paper. Claudia stood up, blanket over her arm, crossed to it, and said, laughing, playing to Destiny's phone, "I love Grandma Beverly, but we have a whole vision for the nursery." She held the blanket out over the open bin like a magician about to drop a scarf. "We only use luxury things here." And she let go. My blanket, Gerald's sailboats, Gerald's initials, Gerald's $50,000, Gerald's last letter to the grandson he'd never meet, dropped into the trash can on top of the torn wrapping paper. The room laughed. Not everyone, but enough. The nervous follow-the-leader laugh of people who've decided the powerful person in the room is the one being funny. Destiny's phone caught all of it. Renee clapped, delighted. And my son, my Nathan, stood against the wall, went pale, opened his mouth, and closed it again. He said nothing. That was the worst second of the entire day, not the blanket going into the bin. My son's mouth closing. "We only use luxury things here. I have heard a lot of unkind things in 66 years. None of it ever landed like those 5 words in that bright room with my husband's heart sitting in a garbage can. Here's what I want you to understand about that moment because it's the hinge of everything. I had a choice. I could have stood up and said, 'Do you have any idea what you just threw away? There is $50,000 in that blanket. There is the last letter your child's grandfather ever wrote.' I could have made a scene that would have lived in that town forever. Part of me, the mother, the widow, the woman whose ruined hands had bled into those rows, part of me wanted to badly, but I didn't, because 3 things were true at once. The bonds and the letter were safe, sewn shut inside the lining, and Claudia hadn't found them and wasn't going to. A camera was running, and the cruelty was being recorded by the cruel woman's own friend, which meant the truth would keep perfectly well without my help, and this is the one that decided it. I looked at that smug, performing, frightened young woman, and I understood that the worst possible thing I could give her was not a scene. It was the truth, delivered later, when she could no longer pretend she didn't know. So I did the only thing that had any dignity in it. I stood up quietly, walked to the trash can, and reached in to take back what was mine. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and had something you made with love treated like garbage, had your effort and your time and your heart tossed aside because it didn't come with the right label, then you know there's a particular silence that follows. The silence of deciding how much of yourself you're willing to defend in front of people who've already decided you're not worth defending. If that silence is familiar to you, stay with me, because this is where it turns. I lifted the blanket out of the trash can. A few torn pieces of wrapping paper clung to it. I brushed them off calmly, the way you'd brush crumbs from a child's shirt. I folded it neatly, the way 38 years behind an alterations counter teaches your hands to fold without thinking, and I tucked it into my bag. The room had gone quiet. The laugh had curdled. Even Claudia seemed to sense she'd misjudged something, though she covered it quickly with a bright, "Oh, did you want it back? That's fine. Take it." "Sorry, it's all right, dear," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "It's not really your kind of thing. I'll keep it." And that steadiness, I could see it land on her. It bothered her far more than anger would have. She'd braced for tears or a tantrum. A calm older woman folding a blanket and saying, "I'll keep it," did not fit into anything she'd prepared for. "I think I'll head out," I said to the room gently. "Thank you for having me. Congratulations on the baby." I found Patricia's eyes, gave her a small nod, and I picked up my bag with Gerald inside it, and I walked out of Renee's boutique hotel of a house with my back straight. I didn't cry until I reached the car. In the car, with the door shut and the glossy house in my rearview mirror, I let myself fall apart for exactly as long as it took to feel it. I held the blanket against my chest. It still smelled faintly of the trash can, banana peel, plastic bag, cleaning product. And somehow, that was the thing that undid me completely. That Gerald's last gift, his 30 years of patient love, had spent 2 minutes smelling like someone else's garbage because a young woman thought it would look good on her page. "I'm so sorry, Gerald," I whispered. "I should have protected it better." But here's the strange thing about grief and clarity. They can ride in the same car. By the time the tears stopped, something underneath them had gone very calm and very certain. The way the surface of water goes still and you can suddenly see all the way to the bottom. I was not going to give Claudia those bonds. Not like this. Not into hands that had called 30 years of love homemade and tossed it in a bin for content. Gerald's wish had been make it last. Make them find it. Make it mean something. You cannot hand a legacy to someone who throws legacies in the trash for an audience. It would be like pouring something irreplaceable into a broken cup. But the baby, little Elliot, who hadn't done anything, who was innocent of every bit of it. The baby still deserved his grandfather's gift. That was never in question. Gerald had saved it for the child, not for the child's mother. So somewhere on the drive home, I started very quietly to think like the practical woman I am. Not about how to make a scene. About how to make this last, exactly the way Gerald had asked, in a way that no one could ever throw away. The phone was already ringing when I walked in. It wasn't Nathan. Not yet. It was Patricia. "Bev." Her voice was tight. "I am so ashamed of that whole room. I should have said something. I should have stood up." "You and Nathan both," I said, not unkindly. "It's all right, Patricia. I have it. It's safe." She didn't find the pocket. A pause on the line. "She doesn't know about the bonds. The letter?" "No," I said. "She just thinks she threw away a homemade blanket." Patricia was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that lit the fuse, though neither of us knew it yet. "Bev, I have to tell you. After you left, I was so rattled. I said something to Nathan. I didn't think. I told him his father would have been heartbroken. All those bonds finally going to the baby in the blanket just like Gerald wanted." And her voice caught. "Bev." The look on Nathan's face. I don't think he knew. I think I just told my nephew what was inside the thing he'd watched his wife throw in the garbage. I closed my eyes. "It's all right, Patricia," I said again, though my heart had started to ache in a new direction, toward my son. "He went white as a sheet," Patricia said. "He left right after without a word to Claudia. Just left." I thanked her and hung up, and I stood in my kitchen holding the blanket. And I understood that somewhere across town, my son was driving with a piece of information detonating slowly inside him. That he now knew the blanket in the bin had held his dead father's 30-year gift and his last letter. That he'd watched it happen and laughed his nervous laugh and said nothing. I put the kettle on and I waited, because I knew the way mothers know that Nathan would call. 3 minutes later, he did. Before I tell you about the call, let me tell you what I'd done in those few minutes of waiting. because it matters. I'd taken the blanket to my kitchen table, and with a seam ripper, the same little tool I'd used 10,000 times in the shop, I'd carefully opened the inner pocket, not to remove anything, just to make sure it was all still there, undamaged, to touch it. The bonds were exactly as I'd folded them. 30 years of Gerald's patience in a neat rubber-banded stack, and the letter in its sealed envelope, to be opened when you're 18. All my love, Grandpa Gerald. I held that envelope and I thought about the hospital room where he dictated it, pausing for breath between sentences, making me read it back. He'd wanted that letter to outlive him by decades. He'd wanted a teenager someday, long after Gerald was a photograph on a shelf, to open an envelope and meet his grandfather for the first time. And a young woman in a party dress had nearly thrown that meeting into a trash can for a laugh. Make her look inside the blanket, Gerald had said. Make them find it. Make it last. She never looked. That was the bitter joke at the center of everything, the one thing Gerald asked. And Claudia had held the blanket, judged it in about 4 seconds, and tossed it, never once feeling along the seam, never knowing she was 30 seconds and one curious touch away from $50,000 and her child's inheritance. I refolded everything and slipped it back into the pocket. I did not sew it shut again. I had a feeling I'd be opening it properly soon, for the right people, in the right room. Then the phone rang, and it was my son, and his voice was already broken before he said a single word. Nathan had been standing by the wall in that awful second after the blanket dropped, fighting the urge to cross the room and pull it out himself, and losing the fight because Claudia was laughing and Destiny was filming, and making a scene would have ruined the afternoon. So he'd swallowed it. Told himself it was just a blanket. Told himself he'd smooth it over with me later. The old reflex. Choose easier. Then Patricia had appeared at his elbow, shaken, and said the words, $50,000 in bonds. Your father's last letter, in the blanket, just like Gerald wanted. Nathan said it was like the floor disappeared beneath him. He turned and looked at the trash can, and of course it was empty now because I'd taken the blanket. And for one horrible minute, he thought it was gone. Genuinely gone. That his wife had thrown his father's final gift into a bin that someone would haul to a curb, and that he had stood there and let it happen and laughed. He didn't confront Claudia. He couldn't even look at her. He just walked out of the party, got into his car, and sat in the driveway with his hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to add up what he'd allowed. Then he called the one person who would know, the one person who had made the blanket, his mother. Mom. His voice cracked on the single syllable. Mom, please tell me you took the blanket home. Please tell me you have it. I have it, sweetheart, I said. It's right here on my kitchen table. It's safe. I heard him exhale like a man surfacing from deep water, a long shaking breath that turned halfway through into something that wasn't quite a sob. Oh, thank God, he said. Oh, thank God. Then, Mom, what was folded inside that blanket? And there it was, the question the whole day had been driving toward. Your father's savings bonds, Kyle, I said gently. All of them. The ones he bought for his first grandchild, every birthday and every bonus, for almost 30 years. They came due this year. They're worth just under $50,000. I let that sit. And his letter, I said. The last one. The one he dictated to me in the hospital for the baby to open at 18, to meet his grandfather someday. That's what was folded inside the blanket, sweetheart. That's what Gerald sewed his whole heart into. That's what you watched go into the trash. The line went very, very quiet. And then my son, my gentle, peacekeeping, conflict-avoiding son, made a sound I had not heard from him since he was a small boy. A raw, helpless, breaking sound. And he said, I didn't stop her, Mom. I was right there and I didn't stop her. I let him cry. Sometimes that's the whole job of being someone's mother. You let them cry and you don't rush it and you don't fix it too fast. I kept telling myself it was just a blanket, he said when he could speak again. That's what I told myself in that room. Don't make a thing of it. It's just a blanket. And it was, Mom, it was Dad. It was his hole. And I heard him trying to find the end of that sentence and not being able to. I know, I said. How are you so calm, he asked. How are you not? I would understand if you never spoke to either of us again. Because I have it, Nathan, I said. Because your father's gift is safe on my kitchen table, and that baby is going to receive every cent of it and every word of that letter. Nothing precious was actually lost today, except maybe some illusions. And those needed losing. I paused, and because being calm is the only thing I've ever found that the people who threw it away can't argue with. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you want to do? Tell me what you want and I'll do it. For once in my marriage, I'll do the right thing instead of the easy one. And there it was. The first real backbone I'd heard in my son's voice in years. It had cost him this much to find it. Maybe it always does. I want one thing, I told him. I want the whole family in one room. Your Aunt Patricia, Claudia, Renee, if she'll come. And I want to give Elliot his grandfather's gift properly, out loud, where everyone can see exactly what it is and exactly what almost happened to it. Frank said make her look inside the blanket, so we're going to open the blanket together, just a little later than planned. Nathan told Claudia that night. He had to. He couldn't sit across a kitchen table from her holding something that size. I wasn't there. But I heard about it from both of them eventually, and the two versions tell you everything you need to know about the people who told them. Nathan's version. He sat her down and told her there had been $50,000, and his father's last letter sewn into the blanket she had thrown away on camera. And Claudia's first words, her very first words, were not, "Oh my God," or "Is it gone," or "What have I done?" Her first words were, "Well, how was I supposed to know? She should have said something. Who sews money into a blanket? That's insane." This is kind of her fault, honestly. This is kind of her fault. That sentence is the whole of Claudia, I'm afraid. Caught doing something genuinely unforgivable, her instinct was not remorse, but damage control. To find the angle where she was the wronged party. She'd thrown a dead man's legacy in the trash, and within 30 seconds she'd constructed a version where the real villain was the grieving widow who hadn't labeled her gift properly. Claudia's version, when I heard it later, was that she'd been blindsided and made to feel terrible over an honest mistake, and that nobody appreciates how stressful organizing a shower is. Not once in any telling did Claudia say the words, "I'm sorry," and actually mean them. I want you to hold on to that because it matters for what I decided next. I did not lock those bonds away to be cruel. I locked them away because a woman who responds to throwing away your husband's heart with, honestly, that's kind of her fault, is not a woman you hand an unlocked inheritance to. So I made some calls of my own the following week with my reading glasses on and Gerald's old wooden box open on the table beside me. I'd spent 38 years being good with my hands and quietly good with money. And now I put both to work. I went to the bank with the bonds, and a patient young man helped me confirm what Gerald had told me. $46,000 and change, every dollar of it earned by a man buying small and waiting long. Then I went to see a woman named Harriet who handles these things properly, and I set up an education trust for Elliot, a real one, locked tight. The money would go to the child, his schooling, his start in life, administered independently, where it could not be spent or borrowed against, or honestly, that's kind of her faulted by anyone. Not by Claudia, not by Nathan, not even by me. The child's, and only the child's, the way Gerald intended. It cost me something to lock Nathan out, too. I won't pretend it didn't sting, but Gerald's wish was for the grandchild, and the cleanest way to honor a wish is to make it impossible to bend. Then I did the other thing, the more important thing. I made copies of nothing and kept the original of everything, and I planned a family dinner, a small one at my house, where I have the home court advantage of a kitchen that smells like 38 years of good meals. and I decided that at that dinner, in front of everyone, I was going to do exactly what Gerald asked. I was going to make them open the blanket. This time the right way. It took a few weeks to arrange, partly because the baby arrived in the middle of it. Elliot came on a rainy Wednesday, 7 pounds and already furious about it with, and I'm not making this up, his grandfather's exact frown. The first time they put him in my arms, that cross little face working itself up to a holler, I saw Gerald so clearly I had to sit down. "There you are," I whispered to him. "We've been saving up for you a long time, little man." The baby softened things temporarily. Even Claudia was different, exhausted and human in the way new mothers are. The labels temporarily forgotten under spit up and no sleep. For a few days, I let myself hope the dinner might not even be necessary. But then I saw Claudia's first photographed post of Elliot, staged, filtered, in a designer outfit, captioned with brand names, and I knew the softness was a phase. The values were the foundation. Elliot was already being measured for the same little tags his mother had been raised inside, which meant Gerald's gift and Gerald's letter mattered more than ever. That baby was going to grow up in a house that taught him a thing's worth is printed on its label. Somewhere in his life he was going to need the opposite lesson, sewn by hand, paid for in patience, waiting in a sealed envelope marked 18. So I sent the invitations, Sunday dinner at my house, everyone. And I got out the blanket. They came on a Sunday evening into a house that smelled like the pot roast I'd made, because some things are weapons of kindness. Nathan, quiet and gray, carrying the baby. Claudia, polished again, wary. Renee, who'd come because not coming would have looked worse than attending. And Patricia, who arrived early to help me and to stand at my shoulder like the sister Gerald would have wanted there. I'd set the table nicely, and in the center, where a centerpiece would go, I'd laid the blanket. Washed now, the trash smell gone, the sailboats bright, Gerald's initials in the corner, folded with the inner pocket facing up. Claudia's eyes went to it the second she walked in, and her face did something complicated. She hadn't expected to see it again. I think she'd hoped it would quietly disappear the way uncomfortable things do for people used to having discomfort handled for them. We ate first. I insisted. You don't do the hard thing on an empty stomach, and I wanted everyone settled and fed and unable to claim they'd been ambushed. We talked about the baby. It was almost pleasant. Claudia even thanked me for the roast and seemed surprised to mean it. Then I cleared the plates, sat back down, and put my hand flat on the blanket. "I'd like to give Elliot his gift from his grandfather now," I said. Properly this time, the way Gerald asked me to before he died. The table went still. Nathan's jaw tightened. Renee set down her wine. Claudia went carefully blank. "Claudia," I said, and my voice was warm and steady and not unkind. "You held this blanket a few weeks ago and you decided what it was worth and you threw it away. I'd like to show you, and everyone here, what you were actually holding." And I picked up the seam ripper. I opened the inner pocket in front of all of them, slow and deliberate, the little tool sliding through the stitches I'd sewn with such care. And I drew out the contents and laid them on the clean table one at a time, like a banker counting out a fortune, which is exactly what I was. "These," I said, setting down the thick rubber-banded stack, "are United States savings bonds. Gerald bought them, Nathan, a few at a time, every birthday and every bonus, for almost 30 years, starting the year you turned 11. The envelope in his closet said, 'For our first grandbaby.' I smoothed the stack. They came due this year. They're worth $46,000. The number went around the table like a cold wind. Renee's mouth opened. Claudia had gone very pale. "And this," I said, setting down the envelope gently, like setting down a sleeping child, "is the last letter your husband ever wrote, Nathan. He dictated it to me in the hospital. It's for Elliot to open on his 18th birthday, so that a boy who will never know his grandfather can sit down someday and hear from him anyway." I touched the envelope. Gerald's exact words to me were, "Make her look inside the blanket. Make them find it. Make it last." I looked up and I looked directly at Claudia, and I kept my voice as gentle as I have ever kept anything. "This is what you held in your hands at that shower," I said. $46,000 and the last words of a dying man. This is what you called homemade. This is what you dropped in a trash can on camera in front of 20 people because it didn't match your nursery aesthetic. Nobody breathed. Destiny's video was still out there in the world, and everyone at that table knew it. Claudia did what Claudia does. She reached immediately for the version where she was the victim. "You can't put this on me," she said, her voice climbing. "How was I supposed to know? Who sews $50,000 into a blanket and doesn't tell anyone? That's basically a trap. You set me up." "I didn't let you do anything, Claudia," I said, still calm. Gerald asked with his dying breath that the gift be hidden in something handmade so it would be treasured instead of simply spent. I honored him. I assumed, foolishly I'll grant you, that no one would throw a handmade blanket in the garbage. That assumption was my only mistake. The throwing was entirely yours. "It was a joke," she said. "It was for the camera." I finished gently. "I know. That's rather the whole problem." I folded my hands on the table. "You only use luxury things, Claudia. You told the whole room. So you took the only priceless thing you were given that day and you put it in the trash because it didn't have a logo on it, and because your friend was filming, and because you have been taught your entire life that worth is something printed on a tag." I let it land. There is no tag on love. There's no brand name on 30 years of a man saving for a child he knew he might not live to meet. You couldn't see it because you've never been taught how to look. And it nearly cost your son his inheritance and his grandfather's last words. Renee started to say something. Claudia didn't, and I turned my eyes to her just once. "Renee," I said, "you taught her how to look. I'd sit this one out." Renee sat it out. Then I told them what I'd decided, because mercy and consequence can sit at the same table, and I'd raise Nathan to know the difference. "Here's what happens now," I said. "Elliot gets every cent. Gerald saved it for the baby, and the baby will have it." I laid my hand on the bonds, but not the way it was meant to be given. I can't hand an open inheritance to a household that throws legacies in the trash for content. So this money is going into a locked education trust, administered independently for Elliot and Elliot alone, for his schooling and his start in life. It cannot be spent, borrowed against, or touched by his parents, not by Claudia, not by Nathan, not by me. Nathan nodded slowly. I saw with a small ache that he understood, and that the being locked out included him, and that he didn't argue because he knew he'd earned it by the wall that afternoon. "And the blanket," I said, "comes home with me tonight. Elliot can have it when I see it will be honored and not before. A thing isn't safe in a house that didn't know it was precious." Claudia opened her mouth, and I think she meant to protest the blanket, which tells you she still hadn't fully understood a word. And Nathan, my quiet son, finally spoke. Claudia, just her name, but in a voice I had never once heard him use with her. "Don't. Not one more word. Not about the blanket. Not about whose fault. Not one more word." And Claudia, for the first time since I'd known her, closed her mouth and kept it closed. It had taken $50,000 and a dead man's letter to give my son a spine. But there it was. Better late than never. There was one thing left to do. The most important thing. The thing Gerald actually wanted. "His letter is for Elliot at 18, I said, "and it will wait sealed in the trust until then. But Gerald wrote one part for all of us too. A small opening for the day the family first learned about the gift. He made me promise to read it out loud when that day came. I took a second smaller envelope from my cardigan pocket. He didn't know it would be a day quite like this. But here we are." I opened it. My hands shook, not from the arthritis this time, and I read my husband's words to his family in my kitchen with his grandson asleep in his son's arms. "If you're hearing this," I read, "then the little one, has finally arrived, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there to be a nuisance about it. I've been saving for this baby since Nathan was 11 years old, because the best thing my own grandfather ever gave me wasn't money. It was the proof that someone was thinking of me before I existed. That's what's in this blanket. Proof you were wanted, little one, by an old man who never got to meet you. Spend the money on something that lasts. And whatever you do, my voice broke here, and I let it. Be the kind of family that knows the difference between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth. Your grandmother does. Learn it from her. All my love, Grandpa Gerald. The room was silent. Patricia was weeping openly. Nathan had his face pressed to the top of his sleeping son's head, his shoulders shaking. And Claudia was looking at the blanket on the table, the one she'd thrown away, and for the first time, I think, actually seeing it. It was too late to be forgiveness, but it might, just might, have been the beginning of learning how to look. I folded the letter back into its envelope. The hard part was done. And I'm not a cruel woman. So I softened, the way you let a room breathe after a hard truth. I didn't do this to humiliate you, Claudia, I said, though I understand it feels that way. I did it because that baby is going to grow up in your house learning your values, and someday he's going to need to know there was another way to measure things. The bonds are for his future. The letter is for his heart. And the blanket, I rested my hand on it, is just to remind everyone, including me, that the most precious thing in a room is almost never the most expensive one. I looked at Nathan. You stayed quiet at that shower because quiet was easier, I said. You've stayed quiet your whole life because it was easier. I'm not angry at you, but I need you to hear me as your mother. The blanket survived because I refused to be quiet about what it was worth, even when being quiet would have been so much more comfortable. That's the inheritance, son, not the bonds. He nodded. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. I'm Elliot's grandmother, I said to the whole table. Not optional, not a relative you tolerate at holidays. I made that baby a blanket with hands that don't work properly anymore, and I will be in his life fully, or this family will have a much harder conversation than this one. Those are the terms. Nobody argued with the terms. Here's how things settled in the months after, because I know you want the ledger and not just the feeling. The trust is locked and growing. $46,000 sitting quietly doing for Elliot exactly what Gerald intended, waiting patiently, the way Gerald himself always would have. Elliot can't touch it until he's grown, and neither can anyone else. That's the point. Gerald thought in decades. So now does his grandson's future. Destiny's video, the one of Claudia dropping the blanket and saying we only use luxury things here, turned out to have been seen by far more of the family than Claudia had realized. She'd posted it as a cute moment before any of us knew what was inside. She took it down the day Nathan told her the truth. But the internet keeps what it's given, and enough people had already seen it that Claudia spent a long, quiet season being known in her own circle as the woman who threw away her child's inheritance for a laugh. I didn't do that to her. She filmed it herself. There's a lesson in that, too, about living for a camera. Renee and I are not close. We never will be. But she has stopped saying, bless her heart, in my direction, which I count as a diplomatic victory. Claudia and I are careful with each other. She has never fully apologized. She's not built for it. But she asked me a few weeks after the dinner in a small voice if I would teach her to knit. I said yes. We've made a lopsided, wonderful, ugly little hat for Elliot together. Her first handmade thing. She kept it. She didn't throw it away. It's a start. Nathan is the one who changed the most. Grief and shame did to him what 40 years of comfort never could. They grew him a backbone. He came to me about a month after the dinner, alone, and sat at my kitchen table where the blanket had been, and he said, I've been going back over it, Mom. The shower. And I keep landing on the same thing. I didn't fail Dad when I let the blanket go in that bin. I'd failed him 100 times before that, Every time I stayed quiet to keep Claudia happy. The blanket was just the time I couldn't unsee it. That's a hard thing to know about yourself. I said, you knew it about yourself for years. He said, why didn't you ever tell me? Because some things a person has to find for himself, I told him. I could have said it 1,000 times. It took a blanket in a bin to make you believe it. He's different now. He speaks up. He and Claudia are in counseling, which I never thought I'd see. He still keeps Gerald's old fishing cap on the hook by the door, and now he's told Elliot he'll teach him to fish himself, the way Grandpa would have. I'm still learning how to not choose easier, he told me, but I'm choosing it on purpose now. That's new. It is, and I'm proud of him. Better late. The blanket lives on Elliot's crib now. It took a few months, long enough for me to be sure the house it was going into had learned, even a little, what it was holding. When I finally brought it over, Claudia had cleared a place of honor for it and put away the designer throw that used to be there, and she didn't say a word about aesthetics. She just watched me lay Gerald's sailboats over her son, and she touched the corner with his initials, and she said quietly, "Gee, I never even noticed that was there." "Most people don't," I said. "You have to know to look. My hands are worse this winter. Some mornings the needles win and I can't knit at all. But I'm making Elliot a small sweater, slowly, a few rows on the good days, with his grandfather's initials hidden in the cuff, where he'll find them someday if he knows to look. Because that's what we do, the homemade grandmothers. We sew ourselves into things quietly and we wait. Gerald taught me that. Time pays interest on patience. If there's one thing I'd hand you from all of this, it's this. The world will tell you louder every year that worth is something you can read off a label, that the expensive gift is the real one, and the handmade one is sweet, but lesser. Don't you believe it? The most valuable things in any room are almost always the quiet ones, made by hand, given without logos, easy to throw away if you've never been taught how to look. Learn how to look. And whatever you love, sew it into something that lasts. And never let anyone tell you it belongs in the trash. That's my story. One homemade blanket, one trash can, and a love worth more than the whole designer room. If it reminded you of a handmade gift you still treasure, go tell that person tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.